Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. A reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You will be limited to one question and one follow-up. I will now hand it over to Minister Katrine Conroy.
Thank you, Terry, and good afternoon. And I want to recognize the Indigenous nations on whose traditional territory we are gathered today. And I am joining you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. I'm also here today with Gary Merkel, co-author of the Old Growth Strategic Review and one of the 5 members of the independent technical panel of scientists, foresters, and ecologists whose work we'll be discussing today. So BC is home to some of the most majestic forests on the planet. These forests, these giant, ancient, majestic old-growth trees are part of who we are in British Columbia. Thousands of us work in the forests, enjoy exploring the forests, or live in or near the forests. However, we are in challenging times. Together, we're facing a climate change crisis that's brought drought, unprecedented heat, and an incredibly challenging wildfire season. We saw too many of our communities and too much of our forests impacted. As British Columbians, we cherish our forests, and people have been clear. They want us to take a different approach on forestry. Last fall, we released the findings of the Old Growth Strategic Review and began working on implementing all 14 recommendations. We've since announced old growth deferrals in 11 areas across the province, totaling 200,000 hectares. This spring, we announced our new vision for forest care in British Columbia through the intentions paper. We also announced a new technical advisory panel to help us identify the at-risk old growth across the province. And the legislation in front of the House right now builds on our vision, as will future amendments to the Forest Act that will be introduced soon. Our new approach takes care of the whole forest environment. We know that healthy ecosystems provide multiple benefits, including clean air, clean water, carbon storage, and rich biodiversity. It means increased protection of our oldest and most ancient old-growth forests. It means Indigenous peoples are full partners in sustainable forest management. And it means workers and communities benefit from secure, innovative forestry jobs for generations to come. In line with the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review, we are taking action to sustain our forests for future generations. With the support of the independent scientific panel, we've identified 2.6 million hectares of our largest, rarest, and most ancient old-growth forests. Our government is prepared to defer harvests within these 2.6 million hectares of old growth, pending consultation with First Nations rights and title holders. To be clear, deferring harvest in an area this large is unprecedented and surpasses the size of 226 cities of Vancouver, or over 6,400 Stanley Parks. Details of these forest stands, mapped and defined by the panel, have already been shared with First Nations and are being made public today. We know there are areas identified by the panel where First Nations are already working towards sustainable forest management and old growth conservation. For example, in areas like Great Bear Rainforest and on Haida Gwaii, and we want this work to continue. Our focus for this 2.6 million hectares is to work in partnership with First Nations on the deferral of the most at-risk old-growth forests in their traditional territories. These deferrals will allow time to develop a new approach for how we care for our forests to better serve all of our goals. We need to make sure this is right. New approaches for old-growth forest management will be worked on in collaboration with First Nations, local communities, workers, and industry. To support the deferral process, government will also immediately cease selling BC timber sales licenses in these areas. This will help prevent harvesting of our most at-risk old-growth forests while discussion with First Nations are underway. We recognize that these deferrals may have impacts to workers, communities, First Nations, small businesses, and industry. The government's preliminary detailed socioeconomic analysis shows that up to 4,500 jobs could be impacted if all 2.6 million hectares were immediately deferred. In response, we are developing a comprehensive suite of coordinated programs to support workers and communities. These supports will focus on a forest employment program aimed at creating short-term employment opportunities, skills training and educational opportunities, funding to support workers 55 plus interested in bridging to early retirement, supports for job creation in rural BC through value-added forestry and made in BC manufacturing, local infrastructure and economic development projects that promote diversification and resilience, and community rapid response teams to coordinate community strategic planning and supports. So to all of those listening, I want you to know that our government has your back. We will have more to say on the specifics of these support programs in the weeks ahead. And I'd like to thank the Independent Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel for the countless hours they spent working on this panel this summer. Their work has helped us to move forward with our new approach to forestry with a focus on healthy ecosystems and healthy forests. We're building a new vision for forest care to better share all the benefits of our forests together for generations and generations to come, so that our kids and grandkids benefit from healthy forests today and into the future. Our government is doing the hard work now to secure old growth forests for that future. So thank you. And now it gives me a great deal of pleasure to invite Gary to say a few words.
Thank you, Madam Minister. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the lands of my brothers and sisters, the Indigenous groups who we are on today. And I want to also acknowledge a couple people to start, particularly Al Gorley. Him and I co-authored the Old Growth Strategic Review and spent a lot of time visiting everybody in this province this summer. Brilliant, brilliant mind. I really have nothing but time for this fellow and his wisdom. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Technical Advisory Panel, Karen Price, Dave Doust, Lisa Mathis, and Rachel Holt. These are some of the most brilliant analysts I think I've worked with in my career, and I worked with quite a few hundred. And in particular, I'd like to thank the provincial government for having the foresight and courage to actually adopt this report in its full. Al and I weren't sure what was going to happen to it. It's a couple old guys just saying what they believe and repeating back what we heard from British Columbia. And it's an exciting and scary time. I just want to talk for 1 second about old growth and ecosystem health, because these are words that sound great, but we don't really know what they mean. An old growth forest is a forest that has reached a state where it's relatively stable in terms of its evolution, because it's reached a level of complexity and an amount of biodiversity, biological things that are in it and connections in it that, you know, things come and go, but it's pretty stable because it's gotten so old. But these old trees live on old ecosystems. The old forests in British Columbia, our old forests range, old trees range from about 200 to 1,200 years old. Some of our ecosystems in British Columbia have remained relatively undisturbed since the last ice age, more than 10,000 years. Many of these forests are possible because of the ecosystems that they live on. And while we love these trees, without those underlying ecosystems, we don't get these forests. We can't keep our landscapes healthy. We can't do all of the things that the minister talked about in terms of benefits. And we can grow new trees. They are renewable. These ecosystems, in most cases, are not renewable. They will never come back in a lifetime, and possibly ever, with the effects of climate change. Today, this deferral package is the start of a path towards changing our forest management regime to one that focuses on ecosystem health. Previously in British Columbia, we managed for timber subject to constraints. And that's how we grew up as British Columbia. We've been in this for 200 years now. And it's part of everything we do. It's built right into the core of our systems. It's built into our psyche as British Columbians. And we dismantling and changing that and moving this path forward is a large systemic change. Deferrals are the first step in this path. We are temporarily pausing harvesting in these most at-risk forests that are at risk of irreversible loss to give us some time to plan for how we're going to manage for ecosystem health. And so this is, and we're doing this right in the middle of implementing DRIPA joint management with Indigenous groups across the province, and right in the middle of the worst pandemic that I think any of us has ever seen, and doesn't let us have face-to-face and conversations. This, by necessity, needs to be an inclusive process, and both of these things make it extremely difficult to move through this transition on top of everything else. I think I'll close with, we advocate a paradigm shift in our report, Al and I, paradigm shift from a paradigm, a way of thinking that manages for timber subject to constraints, to a paradigm that manages for ecosystem health. We heard from every group across this province, municipalities, First Nations, members of the forest sector, members of every other sector that depends on or live with forests, that we need to change the way we are looking after our forests, and people were not happy. This was the thing that I found most remarkable, was the level of consistency in that message. And so here we are, starting down that path, and I'm frankly honored, and I'll do whatever I can to support this transition to move forward in a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, and we'll move to questions. And I just want people to know that Gary and I are both available for questions as well. I have, if there's anything technical, I have Deputy Minister Rick Manwaring, Chief Forester Diane Nichols, and Assistant Deputy Minister David Muter with me as well.
Thank you very much, Minister. A reminder to reporters on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You will be limited to one question and one follow-up. For our first question, we go to Justine Hunter, Globe and Mail. Justine, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. The first question I have is for Minister Conroy. Canada just signed an agreement to halt and reverse deforestation by the year 2030. And here's your government, after 2 years of talking about it, now launching talks on temporary deferrals that may slow down the rate of old growth logging. I'm wondering, do you support what Canada has agreed to at COP26? And if so, how much more do you think British Columbia needs to do to be part of the global solution here?
I think it supports our vision moving forward, Justine, and thanks for the question. I mean, what we're moving forward on is protecting our oldest and most ancient forests. We're also doing it with Indigenous peoples as fully engaged partners in we're moving forward on sustainable forest management. But we're also making sure that workers and communities are part of this too, and that they can benefit from a secure and innovative forestry that we have to look to the future about. You know, this is forestry jobs that are for generations to come, but it's also ensuring that we're protecting those old growth forests, which is exactly what we're doing, and moving forward doing that, and it's exactly in line with what they're talking about in Scotland.
Justine, do you have a follow-up?
Mr. Merkel, I'm wondering if we haven't seen the maps yet; they haven't been released. So, if you could give us a kind of a description of where most of this 2.6 million hectares of proposed deferral land is. I'm guessing it's coastal primarily, but we were told it's everywhere. So if you could give us a bit of a sense of that, please. And also, what happens to old growth logging in BC? If we take 1/3 of this sensitive, rare old growth and put it aside, do we just see a shift? Are we at risk of just seeing a shift to other parts of old growth in terms of logging?
Great questions. Deferrals are targeted at the ecosystems that are most at risk of irreversible loss at this moment in time. And they're temporary pauses. They occur across the province, but if you visualize areas that have the most richest old growth and have been inhabited and harvested for the longest periods, that is likely where you're going to see some of the biggest concentrations, because those ecosystems, particularly in the valley bottoms, many of those are close to gone. Some are actually gone now. So that's where it would be. What was the second part of that question again? It was, do you remember? Anybody remember?
Can you refresh us on the second part of your question?
See a shift of old growth logging to those unprotected areas now.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure that'll happen in the short term. One of our recommendations in the old growth review was to change our silviculture practices and the way we harvest forests to mimic what we call in forestry terms the natural disturbance type, NDT, which means that we would harvest in a manner more like the way nature would change the forest. In some coastal forests, that's a few trees at a time. Even in fire ecosystems, there's always lots left after a fire and lots of structure. So our recommendation, one of our recommendations, is to adopt these types of systems across the province, which means now some of the biggest impacts come from clear-cut logging and the kind of cleaning bare and setting ecosystems back. These types of systems have a much lower footprint on the land. They are more expensive, but they do take more people to do, so we would have increased jobs through that. And over time, what we've seen in other countries is people who adopt these kinds of methods, people become more comfortable with them. Right now, we live in an all or nothing type paradigm. Take it or leave it. And this is kind of saying take it, but take it gently. Thank you.
For the next question, we go to Vaughn Palmer, Vancouver Sun. Vaughn, please go ahead.
Good day, Minister. Thank you for your time today. Mr. Merkel said last spring that in the event of a total moratorium on old-growth logging, the transition cost would be in the billions of dollars. In light of his estimate, isn't it likely that the transition costs for these deferrals would be in the hundreds of millions of dollars?
So I'll also remind you, Vaughn, thank you for the question, but Mr. Merkel also said that they weren't advocating for a total stop to all old-growth logging in the province as part of their report. And our socio-economic analysis that we did showed that there was approximately 4,500 jobs that would be affected by the deferrals in the 2.6 million hectares of forests that we are looking at deferring. Yeah, if they're made permanent. Thank you, Gary. If they're made permanent.
Vaughn, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do, yeah. As I understand it, the deferrals can be implemented two ways. Licensees can volunteer to give up the harvest, or they are looking at a ministerial order rescinding permits and approvals with no compensation in the short run. What impact do you think that will have on your government's efforts to persuade the forest industry to invest more money in value-added production if they're facing that kind of threat with these deferrals?
Well, we've already been talking to industry, and some industry is already moving forward in collaborating with First Nations, working with them on the traditional territory on where they hold their licenses and doing the work that needs to be done, which is great. We're also seeing that the Indigenous nations that we have started to have the discussion with are moving forward as well in that way. And so I believe that we're moving in the right direction, and with the supports we have in place, this is going to work for everyone.
The next question goes to Rob Shaw, Czech News. Rob, please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. Just to follow up on that 4,500 jobs, can you tell us anything about what kind of workers these are, where they are? We have a lot of forest-dependent communities on the island, for example. Are there entire communities that might need assistance? And do you have a budget available in these programs and retirement bridging programs and assistance to put aside to do this?
So the full details on the plans will be come more as the days in the coming days. But just to let you know, some of the programs we're looking at, for instance, the Bridging to Retirement is for people that work in mills, but also contractors. We did this in 2019 when there was a downturn in the industry, and it was oversubscribed. People wanted to do this. They wanted to transition to retirement. They wanted to have that bridging in place. But there was the contractors were left out. So they're not left out this time. It's also not in It's across the province wherever there is a deferral. So we will be working with the communities, with the workers, with industry to move forward on these programs. And there's a number of different programs, as well as we're looking at opportunities for further education or increased skills. We're looking at supports to actual communities. We're looking at new ways of economic diversification in the communities. So there's a whole suite of programs that's in the media package that you'll see oversee that whole suite of programs, and we'll have much more details on it in days to come.
Rob, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. In the technical briefing, we sort of heard that the expectation is these deferrals are for around a couple of years or so, while government comes up with another old growth plan. But it seems hard to imagine that in a couple of years we would just turn around and say it's okay to log these rare and ancient areas that are protected now. So can you sort of shed any light on the long-term plan here? Is it eventually, do we get to the point where government has to buy out these tenures from companies or compensate them in some way to protect this? Or what is the longer vision here beyond this couple years of deferral?
So during the deferral, Rob, one of the things we're going to be doing is talking to Indigenous nations about, their wants, wishes, and needs for the traditional territory that the forest is situated on, and talking about, is it looking at a total deferral? Is it looking at selective harvesting? Is it looking at, working with them on an integrated landscape management plan? Moving forward, this is what we'll be doing with the nations in that 2-year time frame to see what direction we're going to be moving in. Some nations have already reached out and said that they have considerable amounts of areas in their traditional territory has already been deferred, and they want to be left to make sure that they are doing that integrated landscape management plan moving forward. Others are very much interested in deferring. So we have to have those conversations with the Indigenous nations, and that's what the 2-year framework is with, to give us time to do that, give them time to do the integrated landscape management plan that they want to do.
For the next question, we go to Andrew McLeod, the Tyee. Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the reactions you may hear, Minister, is that this is the announcement today that should have been made a year and a half ago when the Old Growth Strategy report was released. I'm wondering what you would say to people who say that the action should have been faster on this.
Well, what I have been saying is we have to get this right. We have to make sure we do this right, not only for the forest, because we have to do this right for the forest, but we have to do this for the Indigenous nations to make sure that they're partners in this. We have to do this for the communities that could be losing jobs within those communities. We have to do it for the workers. So we have to get this right. The last thing I would want to do is do this quickly and not have it done properly. And one of the things that by doing it the way we're doing it, we were able to bring in the technical advisory panel and get that work done so that we could really identify the areas in the province that are at the ancient, rare, and old growth that are actually at risk for irreversible loss.
Andrew, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, sure. I'm wondering, why is it that BCTF can immediately stop advertising sales, so essentially putting deferrals in place immediately, while the other ones have to go for 30 days of consultation? What's the difference there?
So BC timber sales licenses will be will not be advertised, so we will not be putting out any more BC timber sales in the province. We're giving the nations time to have those discussions, to have the discussions amongst themselves, also to have the discussions with our ministry on how they want to move forward, whether they want to move forward with the deferrals, whether they're going to need more time, and how we're going to have those discussions. It's really important, those government-to-government discussions. Some discussions have already been underway for a while, but we want to make sure that we move forward as quickly as we can, but making sure we do it right.
Next question goes to Fran Yanor, Northern Beat. Fran, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. Hi. So first question is, I'm just wondering why, again, sort of a little bit of a follow-up on Andrew and some earlier questions in the technical briefing, but why is harvesting in the deferral areas on First Nation territory not been immediately halted? Why is the sort of status quo, and how can the deferral consultations with nations potentially be occurring while the forests they're discussing are simultaneously being logged?
So what's really important for us is to ensure that we're having those government-to-government discussions with Indigenous nations. This is about talking to the rights and title holders. This is about reconciliation. And we want to make sure that that we're having those discussions with them, that we are looking at their wants, wishes, needs of what they want to see happen on their traditional territory, that they have the opportunity to undertake the integrated landscape management plan, that they are doing the work in collaboration with us. And so we are having those discussions, and that's what's critically important. It was the number one recommendation in the Old Growth Strategic Review to have those government-to-government conversations and discussions with Indigenous nations.
Fran, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. Yes, but if a First Nation is in the middle of having a consultation about the deferral areas that are being logged, and as I understand it, the conservation financing won't be introduced till later in the process. Isn't this sort of forcing some First Nations into logging their own territories for economic reasons? And do you think that this maybe pushes the tougher decisions onto First Nations and industry?
No, I think it's about reconciliation. I think it's about respecting what Indigenous nations want to do on their traditional territory. It's about having those really important discussions with rights and title holders. And that's what our government is committed to. We've been committed to that since we became elected. That's why we introduced DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and that's why we will continue to respect the government-to-government discussions with the rights and title holders.
Our next question goes to Tennille Evelyn, CBC. Tennille, please go ahead.
Hi. Yes, you had mentioned that this could impact 4,500 jobs. Can you give us the estimated financial impact in dollars on that, please?
So it'll impact 4,500 jobs if every area that is identified in the 2.6 million hectares is deferred permanently. So what we are committed to do is when there is going to be a deferral, during those 2 years that we have the time to talk about it, we will do an in-depth socioeconomic analysis of the community that might be affected, of the area that might be affected. So we will have figures that will show how those communities are affected. So we will be doing that work.
Do you have a follow-up, Tennille?
Yeah. Okay. I'm just surprised that you don't have a financial number, but I'm going to move on to my second question. Listening to what you said today, I think environmentalists would ask you that if what we're hearing is that you are moving to protect irreplaceable old growth forests specifically, not all old growth forests, but the irreplaceable part, given that, why are we not protecting all of it?
Well, that was never one of the recommendations from the Old Growth Strategic Review. We have worked with the Technical Advisory Panel to identify the most at-risk old growth in this province, the rare, the ancient, and the old growth, those that are at risk for irreversible loss. And so we are moving forward with those 2.6 million hectares to ensure that we can have those conversations with Indigenous nations to ensure they're protected. And I will remind you that we've already protected over 200,000 hectares that deferred that. So that's already been deferred. So that those are areas where those discussions are continuing as well.
Thank you very much to everyone on the line. Thank you to everyone here in the room. That concludes today's event.
Okay. Thank you.